In a downtown Los Angeles courtroom this week, a prosecutor read a text message out loud. It was sent by a 13-year-old girl. In it, she told the man she was involved with that she'd just had an abortion and that she'd done it for him. He was sitting a few feet away in an orange jail jumpsuit when those words were read into the record. Witnesses in that courtroom, and the officer who's known him since before his arrest, have said the same thing about how he reacted. He didn't. No flinch. No visible response of any kind. That's not editorializing. That's testimony, on the record, from a sheriff's deputy who was in the room. This is the preliminary hearing in the case of the state of California versus David Anthony Burke, the 21-year-old musician known professionally as D4vd, charged with the murder of 14-year-old Celeste Rivas Hernandez. Over 4 days this week, evidence was presented in open court for the first time. Not sealed documents, not summarized allegations relayed secondhand by anonymous sources. Actual witnesses, actual forensic testimony, actual records, under oath, in front of a judge. We're going to walk through what was actually presented, day by day, what's now confirmed on the record, what the defense has managed to push back on, and what still has to happen before this case reaches a trial. One thing needs to be said clearly, up front, and held onto for the entire length of this video. David Burke has pleaded not guilty. He has not been convicted of anything. Everything you're about to hear describes testimony and evidence presented at a preliminary hearing, a stage in the process specifically designed to test whether there's enough evidence for a trial to happen at all. It is not a trial. It does not determine guilt. We're going to keep that distinction in view throughout, even in the places where the evidence described is genuinely overwhelming, because that distinction is the whole point of due process, and it doesn't stop applying just because a case is disturbing. Let's open the file. David Anthony Burke was born in New York and raised in Houston, Texas. Like a lot of young producers of his generation, he didn't come up through a label system or a music school. He came up through a bedroom setup and an internet connection. As a teenager, he was making short instrumental tracks and uploading them to accompany Fortnite montage videos, the kind of low-stakes, high-volume content creation that thousands of teenagers were doing at the same time, most of whom never went anywhere with it. He did. In 2022, a song called Romantic Homicide, moody, lo-fi, emotionally raw, in the specific way that resonated with a very online, very young fan base, went viral on TikTok and then everywhere else. It would go on to accumulate hundreds of millions of streams. That kind of velocity doesn't happen slowly. It happens in weeks, and then the industry shows up. He signed to Darkroom/Interscope, reportedly for an advance in the neighborhood of $600,000. Over the following 2 years, he built out a genuine career, an EP, festival slots, a rapidly growing audience of mostly teenage and young adult fans who related to the confessional, heartbroken quality of his songwriting. By 2025, financial testimony introduced at this hearing would put his gross career earnings across recording, publishing, and merchandise somewhere between $10 and $12 million. He had a debut studio album finished and scheduled for release on April 25, 2025, and a world tour booked behind it. That's the version of David Burke that existed publicly, successful, young, ascending, a face that Gen Z fans had built a real emotional relationship with through his music. It is not the version of him this hearing has spent 4 days establishing under oath. He was arrested on April 16, 2026, almost exactly 1 year after prosecutors allege Celeste died, and charged with first-degree murder, with special circumstances, continuous sexual abuse of a child under 14, and unlawful mutilation of human remains. He has pleaded not guilty to all three. Before we go further into the case against him, it matters that we don't let her become a footnote to it. That happens constantly in cases like this. The victim becomes a body, a set of remains, a data point in someone else's story. So here's who she actually was. Celeste Abigail Rivas Hernandez was born September 7, 2010, and grew up in Lake Elsinore, California, the daughter of Salvadoran immigrant parents. She loved to sing, she loved to dance. Friday nights were movie nights, a standing family tradition her parents have spoken about since her death. Popcorn, a couch, everyone together. She was, by every account her family has given, a kid full of life. Investigators believe she first encountered Burke online, through Discord, through Instagram, when she was around 11 years old. He was, at that point, an adult musician with a rapidly growing online following, and she was an 11-year-old fan with access to the same platforms every kid her age had access to. That gap, between who had power in that relationship from the very first message, is the foundation the entire prosecution is built on. She was reported missing more than once, starting in 2024. Investigators believe she was killed on the night of April 23, 2025, at Burke's rental home in the Hollywood Hills. Her remains weren't discovered until September 8, 2025, one day after what would have been her 15th birthday, inside the front trunk of a Tesla registered to Burke, sitting in a Los Angeles tow yard. She never got to turn 15. The preliminary hearing opened on July 21, 2026, before Judge Charlene Almeida, who alone will decide whether probable cause exists to send this case to trial. There is no jury at this stage. That's an important structural point to understand about preliminary hearings generally. They exist to answer one narrow legal question. Is there enough evidence that a reasonable person could conclude a crime was committed, and this defendant likely committed it? That threshold is deliberately much lower than beyond a reasonable doubt, which is the standard a jury would eventually need to meet at an actual trial. A finding of probable cause here is common. It is not, in any legal sense, a conviction, and it shouldn't be reported or understood as one. With that established, here's what actually happened over 4 days. Prosecutors opened with a piece of evidence that predates Celeste's death by more than a year, a Los Angeles County Sheriff's body camera recording from February 2024. It shows Burke at the front door of his home, speaking with a deputy who'd come to conduct a welfare check after Celeste, then 13 years old, had been reported missing, with her phone records tracing directly back to him. In that video, Burke tells the deputy he'd only met Celeste once in person, that they'd connected through social media, and that she had told him she was 18. That's a claim worth sitting with for a second, because the timeline the prosecution has since built directly contradicts it. According to the deputy's testimony, Burke was calm and nonchalant throughout the entire exchange. No visible anxiety. Nothing that suggested he understood he might be in serious legal jeopardy. Prosecutors allege that by the time this welfare check happened, a sexual relationship between a grown man and a 13-year-old girl had already been ongoing for months, and that message records eventually recovered from Burke's phone stretch back to when Celeste was 11 years old. Day 1 also covered what happened during Burke's booking process, following his arrest in April 2026. Jail intake staff documented several tattoos on his body, including one that hadn't previously been identified by law enforcement, the name Celeste, in faint red ink, on his left ring finger. Testimony established that Celeste had a matching tattoo on her own ring finger, bearing his name. And then came the detail that turns a tattoo from a sentimental footnote into forensic evidence. When Celeste's remains were recovered, her ring finger and pinky finger were missing from her hand. Prosecutors are alleging, directly, that those fingers were removed specifically to eliminate that tattoo as physical evidence tying her identity to his. If that allegation holds up, it reframes the mutilation charge entirely, not as an act of panic, but as a targeted attempt to destroy a specific, identifiable piece of evidence. Day 1 closed on the financial picture. A staffer from Burke's record label testified that he had earned more than $7 million from his record deal alone before his arrest. A former financial manager put his total gross earnings, across recording, publishing and merchandise, between $10 and $11.5 million from 2023 through 2025. Why does a jury eventually need to hear about record deal money in a murder case? Because prosecutors are building a motive argument, and the argument is specifically about timing. His debut album was 48 hours from release, on the night Celeste is believed to have died. A world tour was months away, and testimony introduced later in the hearing would establish that Celeste had been telling people close to her that she wanted out of the relationship, and that she might make it public. Celeste's parents were present in the courtroom for all of Day 1. They would remain present for nearly the entire hearing. Day 2 moved from testimony about relationships and finances into the physical scene itself, Burke's Hollywood Hills garage, searched by Lapton under warrant in September 2025, shortly after Celeste's remains were discovered. Lapped criminalist Lauren Wallace took the stand and described what investigators found: rubber floor mats, a rowing machine, a green tarp, and a Tesla charger plug, all bearing apparent reddish staining. She testified that she used a luminol-based reagent, a standard field test for the possible presence of blood, on these items, and that the mats reacted strongly under that testing. It's worth pausing here to explain, plainly, what that kind of test can and can't tell you. because it becomes relevant to how the defense handled it. A luminol reaction is a presumptive indicator. It tells investigators, this could be blood, and it's worth sending to a lab. It does not, on its own, conclusively confirm blood, and it definitely doesn't identify whose blood it might be. That's what full laboratory DNA analysis is for, and that analysis would come later in the hearing. Investigators also recovered an inflatable pool from the garage, the kind of cheap plastic kiddie pool sold at any big box store, with multiple linear cuts running through the plastic, the kind of damage consistent with a blade being drawn through it. The prosecution's working theory, laid out incrementally across several days of testimony, is that this pool was used to contain blood during the dismemberment of Celeste's body, and that plastic fragments from it later turned up embedded inside her remains. This is where defense attorney Blair Burke did some of her most substantive work in the entire hearing. On cross-examination, she got Wallace to confirm, directly, that field testing alone could not conclusively identify the staining as blood, that a full lab workup would be required to say that with certainty. She also established several gaps in how the scene was processed. The body bag containing Celeste's remains wasn't preserved in full as evidence. Investigators didn't separately document where chainsaws found at the scene had originally been located beyond what appeared in photographs, and a dryer sheet found inside the pool was photographed at the scene but never actually collected as physical evidence. None of these points undo the larger picture the prosecution is building, but that's not really what they're for at this stage. Each one is the kind of specific, concrete gap a defense team can bank for trial, a place to stand later and argue that the investigation, however extensive, wasn't airtight. And not airtight is generally the exact texture that reasonable doubt is made of. Day 2 closed with 2 more pieces of testimony worth understanding together. First, investigators found 11 separate air fresheners inside the Tesla, where Celeste's remains had been stored for months, through a Los Angeles summer, before the vehicle was towed and the smell was finally reported by tow yard workers. Second, financial and travel records showed Burke had arranged international travel to London and separately to Texas, using a business credit card to pay for Celeste's travel during a period when she remained listed as an active missing child in Lake Elsinore. If Day 2 left room for ambiguity, Day 3 largely closed it. This was the day the hearing moved from circumstantial patterns into hard forensic certainty. Lapped criminalist Samantha Tosh testified about the DNA analysis performed on the garage evidence, the mats, the rowing machine, the tarp, the charger plug. Her conclusion, stated under oath, the DNA recovered from those items was 1 septillion times more likely to have originated from Celeste Rivas Hernandez than from an unrelated, random individual. It's worth taking a second to actually register that number, because septillion isn't a word most of us use in daily conversation. A septillion is a 1, followed by 24 zeros. In practical, plain English terms, that statistic isn't probably her blood. It's about as close to scientific certainty as forensic DNA analysis is capable of producing. Whatever room the field testing limitations left open on Day 2 effectively closes here. The lab didn't just confirm it was blood. It confirmed whose. Alongside the DNA, prosecutors introduced cell phone location data and Tesla's own onboard GPS telemetry, 2 entirely independent systems, run by 2 entirely different companies, neither of which has any reason to be wrong in the same way at the same moment. Together, they placed both Burke's phone and his vehicle in a remote area of Santa Barbara County on 3 separate occasions after the night prosecutors believe Celeste died. One of those 3 trips was on the night in question itself, the early hours of April 24th, 2025. During that trip, phone records show an outgoing call placed from Burke's number to Celeste's number, while both devices were already located in that same remote area, not before, not after, but while both phones were already there. The vehicle returned to Los Angeles by 7 a.m., in time for Burke to make a scheduled radio interview promoting his upcoming album release, which was 2 days out. 2 additional trips followed to that same stretch of highway in the weeks after, including one where Tesla's own charging records placed the vehicle at a stop, near the location where a roadside worker would later recover Celeste's ID card. Day 3 closed with testimony that plastic fragments recovered from Celeste's remains during autopsy were physically matched, a direct, fitted match, like puzzle pieces, to material missing from the cut sections of the inflatable pool recovered from Burke's garage. By the end of Day 3, the prosecution had built a case resting on 3 genuinely independent categories of evidence, each corroborating the others without depending on any single witness's memory or account. Forensic DNA evidence at extraordinary statistical certainty, corroborating digital location data from two separate systems, and physical trace evidence matched at the level of a direct fit. That's a difficult structure for a defense to dismantle, because undermining any one category still leaves two intact. Day 4 is the day this hearing drew national attention, for two separate reasons: the medical examiner's testimony and what was found on Burke's phone. The second of those requires some care in how it's discussed, and I want to explain why before getting into it. Deputy Medical Examiner Dr. Grant Ho took the stand first. He testified that Celeste's remains, by the time they were examined, showed advanced decomposition consistent with months inside a sealed vehicle through a California summer, and that she weighed 71 pounds at the time of autopsy. That number is not a reflection of what she weighed in life. It's a reflection of what remained after that length of time and exposure. She was ultimately identified in part through dental records, a retainer wire, still in place, that matched her dental history. Dr. Ho identified two penetrating injuries on the body, one to the right abdomen, affecting the liver, and one to the left chest, both bearing characteristics consistent with a sharp force injury, meaning a knife or similarly edged weapon, rather than a blunt or projectile injury. Asked directly how long it would take to die from the chest wound specifically, he testified, minutes, not instantly. That detail matters, clinically and legally. It speaks to the nature and severity of the injury without requiring speculation about what those final minutes were like, which is not something any autopsy can actually tell you, and not something worth imagining for the sake of a video. The manner of death was ruled a homicide. The official cause of death was listed as multiple penetrating injuries. On cross-examination, Blair Burke secured several real concessions here, and it's worth naming them honestly, rather than glossing past them. Dr. Ho testified that he could not determine who specifically inflicted the wounds. He testified he could not rule out, based on the autopsy findings alone, the possibility that the injuries were self-inflicted, and he testified he could not confirm from the physical evidence whether any kind of struggle had occurred beforehand. Those are meaningful limits on what a single autopsy can establish in isolation, and they are very likely to become central to the defense's argument at an eventual trial, because a cause of death, on its own, doesn't identify a killer. What did not move under cross-examination, however, were his two core, load-bearing conclusions. This was ruled a homicide, and the cause of death was multiple penetrating injuries. Those findings stood. The dismemberment itself was described as having occurred at two separate sites on the body, with cut surfaces consistent with the use of a power tool. Plastic fragments matching the garage pool were confirmed embedded directly in one of the wounds, tying the forensic pathology testimony back to the physical match evidence introduced the day before. Now, the phone. A detective testified to the contents of message records recovered from Burke's device, spanning from August 2022, when Celeste was 11 years old, through April 2025. This video is not going to read that testimony back to you in granular detail, and I want to be direct about why, rather than just skipping past it. What those messages document, according to sworn testimony, is the sexual abuse of a child, including references to multiple pregnancies and abortions during a period when Celeste was 13 years old. The fact that this occurred, and its legal weight in establishing the continuous sexual abuse charge, matters enormously to understanding this case. The specific content of those messages doesn't need to be reproduced in detail to make that point, and reproducing it wouldn't add anything except spectacle. That's a line worth holding, even in coverage of a case this serious. Maybe especially in coverage of a case this serious. What matters, structurally, is how prosecutors are using this evidence to establish both the continuous sexual abuse charge directly and to build a timeline and motive for the murder charge itself. Specifically, testimony that in the weeks before her death, Celeste had begun telling people close to her that she wanted to end the relationship and that she was considering going public with it. Photographs recovered from Burke's phone were also referenced in testimony, including images the court noted could not be displayed publicly, consistent with standard legal protocols around material involving a minor. Celeste's parents, who had remained in the courtroom through the autopsy testimony and the forensic evidence over the preceding 3 days, left the room during this specific portion of the hearing. And across all 4 days, through the DNA statistics, through the GPS corroboration, through the medical examiner's ruling, through the phone records, testimony from officers and courtroom observers consistently described the same thing, Burke showing no visible reaction to any of it. It would be easy, watching a hearing like this from the outside, to write off Blair Burke's cross-examinations as simple denial in the face of overwhelming evidence. That undersells both what a preliminary hearing is legally for and what a competent defense attorney is required to do at this stage, regardless of how damaging the evidence looks from the gallery. Her strategy across 4 days breaks down into a few consistent, identifiable threads. The first is medical uncertainty. Every concession she secured from Dr. Ho, that he cannot say who caused the wounds, cannot rule out self-infliction, cannot confirm whether a struggle occurred, chips directly at the standard that will eventually matter most: guilt beyond a reasonable doubt at trial. It doesn't undo the DNA evidence or the GPS corroboration. It isn't meant to. It's laying the groundwork for a future argument that a cause of death, established with certainty, still doesn't by itself prove who is responsible for causing it. The second thread is investigative process. The unpreserved body bag, the undocumented original location of the chainsaws, the uncollected dryer sheet, the field test that couldn't, on its own, conclusively confirm blood before the lab did. None of these are individually case-breaking. Together, they become a running theme for a future trial argument, that even a large, well-resourced investigation had specific, documentable gaps, and that those gaps deserve weight. Burke's legal team released a statement after his arrest, stating plainly that the evidence would show he did not murder Celeste Rivas Hernandez and was not the cause of her death. That position has not changed across 4 days of hearing testimony that included DNA evidence at 1 in a septillion certainty and a ruled homicide. Legal analysts covering the hearing, including former federal prosecutors speaking to reporters outside the courthouse, have generally said they expect the judge to find probable cause, given how low that specific bar actually is at this stage of the process. But they've also noted, consistently, that a hearing like this hands a defense team something genuinely valuable, regardless of outcome: an early, detailed preview of the prosecution's entire case, and the chance to cross-examine every key witness well ahead of any eventual trial. Nothing about that opportunity is wasted, just because it doesn't change Day 4's headline evidence. Celeste's parents attended nearly every day of this hearing. They sat through testimony about how their daughter died, about the state of her remains after months in a sealed vehicle, about DNA evidence built from her own blood, about a 2-year-old body camera recording of the man now charged with her murder, calmly lying to a deputy about knowing she was a child. They left the room only once, during the portion of testimony covering photographic evidence of a sexual nature. Reporters present in the courtroom described a moment during the presentation of graphic evidence where a spectator had to fan Celeste's mother because it appeared she might faint. The family's attorney, Patrick Steinfeld, spoke to reporters outside the courthouse during the hearing. He described the family as private people doing the best they can under circumstances no parent should have to face. He said they'd expressed appreciation for the work of the prosecuting attorney. He said Celeste was a beautiful girl, full of life, who brought love and joy into her family's home. And he said, plainly, that the family now carries a hole in their heart that will never be replaced. It's worth stepping back and understanding that this 4-day hearing is the product of well over a year of investigative work, most of it happening quietly, long before any of this became public. Celeste was first reported missing in early 2024, at age 13. Investigators traced phone records connecting her to Burke. He was questioned and denied knowing her real age. She returned home briefly, then went missing again months later, with reports placing her traveling to Las Vegas, London, and Texas alongside Burke during that period, all while active missing person notices for her remained open in Lake Elsinore. By early 2025, according to testimony and subsequent reporting, the relationship had reportedly begun to fracture. Celeste had told at least one person close to her that she was pregnant and was considering leaving. On April 23, 2025, with Burke's album 2 days from release, prosecutors allege he arranged transportation for Celeste to travel roughly 80 miles from Lake Elsinore to his Hollywood Hills home. Investigators believe she died there that night. Her remains weren't discovered until September, when workers at a tow yard reported an odor coming from the impounded Tesla. The investigation that followed reportedly involved roughly 50 separate search warrants and a grand jury process spanning more than a dozen days, including testimony from people in Burke's personal and professional circle. He was arrested in April 2026, almost exactly a year after Celeste's death, and has been held without bail since. The preliminary hearing was expected to conclude within days. Judge Almeida will rule on whether probable cause exists to send the case to trial. A substantially lower legal bar than the beyond a reasonable doubt standard a jury would eventually need to apply at trial itself. Most legal observers following the case expect that threshold to be met, given what's been presented. Los Angeles County prosecutors have said publicly they have not ruled out seeking the death penalty, given the special circumstances alleged in the charges. Burke's defense team has maintained, consistently since his arrest, that the evidence will not ultimately show he caused Celeste's death. I want to be exact about where this stands, because precision matters more in a case like this than in almost any other kind of story we cover. David Burke has been charged. He has not been convicted. A preliminary hearing exists specifically to test whether the evidence clears a bar for trial to occur. It is not a trial, and Judge Almeida's ruling, whichever direction it goes, will not be a verdict. What's been presented this week is, by any honest measure, substantial. DNA evidence at a level of statistical certainty that leaves almost no room for coincidence. Corroborating GPS and cell tower data from two entirely independent systems. Physical fit-matched trace evidence, tattoo evidence, tied directly to a specific, alleged act of mutilation, and sworn testimony from a medical examiner establishing a formally ruled homicide. It is also, in the strict legal sense, still short of the standard that would be required to actually convict at trial. And the defense has already shown, across 4 days, exactly where it intends to contest that remaining gap. Medical uncertainty around who inflicted the fatal wounds, and specific, documented weaknesses in how portions of the investigation were processed and preserved. Both of those things are true at the same time. That's the most honest place to leave this, until the next stage of the process actually happens, not before it. I want to close this the way this story should close, with her, not with him. Celeste Abigail Rivas Hernandez was born September 7, 2010. She loved to sing and dance. Friday nights were movie nights with her family. She was 14 years old. Whatever this hearing has established or will go on to establish about the man currently charged in her death, none of it changes who she actually was before any of it happened. A kid from Lake Elsinore whose family is, right now, still sitting through a courtroom process just to understand what happened to her. This hearing isn't finished. When a trial date is eventually set, that's a story we'll continue to follow, accurately, as the process actually unfolds, not ahead of it, and not based on whatever spreads fastest online in the meantime.